I couldn't bear the thought of being stuck with a woman who had a huge pregnant belly, forcing me to raise a child alone. This thought was spinning in my head like an endless nightmare, where I was the main character of a tragicomedy who failed to see the full severity of the consequences. Disgust was reflected in his eyes, and a wide smile appeared on his face, as if he already knew that this day would come. I, in turn, felt more and more how his frowning eyes were becoming for me not only an angry mirror, but also a steel barrier that I had to destroy in order to regain control of my own life. I foresaw that this moment was coming, although I tried to postpone the inevitable, as if I were trying to stop a tornado, but there was no time, it was slipping away, and I knew I couldn't stop it. Gliding down the hallway, I quickly went to my room. Thoughts flashed through my head that could not calm down. Why did I end up here? When I returned, I was holding a document in my hands. I handed him the divorce papers, and his face twisted in shock. He looked at me like someone who had betrayed him, as if I had suddenly pulled out a knife and stabbed him right in the heart. His hands were shaking, and his voice, which had been so confident before, now sounded with a note of rage and indignation. "What the hell?" he hissed, almost not believing what was happening. There were sparks of anger in his eyes, and it was not just bewilderment, but real shock. He screamed, and I felt his words, full of rage, burst out of his throat like a lava flow ready to swallow everything in its path. "Well, it was your idea. Now sign it, quickly. I'll send it tomorrow." I felt his rage gathering strength, but my words, spoken firmly and calmly, did not give him the right to challenge this decision. "Look carefully," I said, not looking away. "I will make you regret the way you treated me, the way you looked down on me all these years. You made that choice yourself, Paul. You took this road yourself." My words may have hurt him more than I could have imagined. His face turned red with anger as he realized that everything he had built so hard was crumbling in a moment. And despite this, I felt not relief, but rather emptiness, as if something important had been taken away and I had no right to regret. "My name is Lisa. I'm 28 years old, and I used to be a housewife until I worked for a mobile company 3 years ago. I met Paul Walter, my boss, when I was 25, and from the very first days he became for me the person who showed me not only the world of business, but also the world where I could become something more. We quickly fell in love with each other, and a year later we got married. I couldn't believe my luck. This successful and charming man became my husband. He was 4 years older than me, and I sincerely believed that he was the support I needed. He was reliable, especially when he taught me how to work in his team, and I immensely appreciated his patience and attention to me as a beginner who didn't know much. I was grateful to him for every word, for every hint, for helping me grow and become a better person. We became friends, often went to dinners, and he invited me on dates, as if I were not only a colleague for him, but also something more. I was over the moon, especially because I had never dated a man before. I admit that before meeting Paul, I was fond of cartoons, and my thoughts often flew into the world of 3D characters, which seemed to me more interesting and real than real men. I never thought that I would meet someone who would become really important to me. But, as it often happens, life does not stand still, and over the years my classmates, older and younger, began to get married and start families. The pressure of society was getting stronger every day, and I realized that it was time to make up my mind. When I fell in love with Paul, I realized that this was not just a passing infatuation. It was my first and last love. I promised myself that if I was with him, it would be forever. That's how our life began together. We got married a year after the beginning of our relationship, and it was a real happiness for me. I was proud of him, proud to be his wife. He was handsome, successful, and popular among our female colleagues. I couldn't believe my happiness when everyone around us said that they were jealous, but at the same time they only wished us happiness. We looked like the perfect couple, and I couldn't imagine what lay ahead. But, as it turned out, all this was not what it seemed at first glance. Paul started cheating, and I was getting more and more lonely every day. His attention gradually began to slide away, and in place of the promises he had made to me at the beginning of our journey, there were only empty words and cold glances. I've always wanted my wife to focus only on household chores. It was his demand, not explicitly uttered, but still understandable to me. In his opinion, it was not only my duty, but also my happiness to become the woman who creates comfort, cooks my favorite food, and takes care of the house. He often repeated, "Don't worry, I can support both of us with my income." These words sounded to me like confidence that everything would be fine if I just stayed around and devoted myself to household chores. But it was so unexpected. "You've never mentioned this before," and I couldn't help but feel alarmed when Paul, without warning, informed me of his decision. I replied in shock, and my eyes, full of bewilderment, could not hide what I felt. "Paul never mentioned that I quit my job before our wedding. I got my current job on his father's recommendation, and I wouldn't leave without warning. For me, it would be like a betrayal, not only professionally, but also personally." I was right. I wanted to explain it, but Paul's eyes silently warned me not to argue. Instinctively, I realized that I shouldn't challenge his decision. I was silent. "I should have told you this before, but now that it's all become a reality, I couldn't believe that he decided everything so abruptly." "Starting tomorrow, it's over," he said. "You don't have to go to work. I'll deal with the transfer." His words sounded so determined that I could barely speak in response. My head was spinning, and a strange feeling appeared in my heart, a mixture of shock and resentment. I was just a housewife whose role had already been decided in advance. His decisions were final, and despite my protests, I couldn't stand up to him. I haven't worked since that day, and leaving my job turned out to be unexpectedly painful. I didn't say goodbye to my colleagues. I couldn't even take the last things as planned. It all seemed strange and unnatural to me, but I was determined to make our marriage work, no matter what. Paul assigned me to do household chores, and I did everything to meet his expectations. I worked hard around the house, cooking, trying to please him, focusing on his favorite dishes. However, despite all my efforts, Paul ate in silence, without commenting on the taste, without showing that he was happy about it. I searched his gaze for a hint of appreciation, but I couldn't find anything. I could feel my heart sinking when he didn't say a word of thanks. After leaving work, I longed for words of appreciation, at least the smallest appreciation of my work. I wanted to hear that everything I do matters to him. But this did not happen. And one day, when I seemed invisible to him, when I began to feel more and more that I was in his shadow, he came up to me with the question, "Is my jacket clean?" He was going to an important meeting, and I, as always, hastened to answer, "Yes, of course." Seeing his domineering side, with a touch of old-fashioned looks, I reminded myself how lucky I was to have married him, and tried to live up to his expectations. We both lived as if everything was perfect, but in fact our relationship increasingly resembled that of an employer and a housekeeper rather than a husband and wife. We didn't communicate, we didn't share emotions, we didn't create what is usually called a homey atmosphere. He wasn't just a husband to me. He was a man who expected to perform duties, and I was the one who performed them. Everything went smoothly like clockwork until one day I got sick. One of those days when I couldn't get out of bed, when my strength left me, I thought I had caught a cold. It was such a strange and difficult day. The next day, while doing my chores, I was lying in bed trying to regain some strength when Paul came into the bedroom. He looked at me with a displeased expression on his face, as if I had no right to be sick. "What are you doing?" "Get up and cook some food," he said, throwing the blanket off me. His words pierced me like a sharp knife. I tried to explain, "I'm sorry, I feel bad. Is there anything you can do for yourself today?" I was hoping for his understanding, but instead I heard only a frown of annoyance. Paul didn't nod or comfort me as I'd hoped. Instead, he said, "You're not working yet, you're lying down just because you feel a little sick." Pitifully. "Get up and kicked me. I was stunned by his cruelty. I got out of bed, and the whole moment seemed to me like something completely alien to the person with whom I once dreamed of spending my life. I never thought that he would demand so much housework from his sick wife. It was so unexpected, so painful. Maybe it was my fault that I hadn't noticed it before. But at that moment, I realized that it had all become too much. I was doing household chores, tears were rolling down my face. It was a moment of truth that I couldn't ignore. Several days passed, and my health showed no signs of improvement. Then I realized that I had missed my period, and in a panic I ran to the pharmacy to buy a pregnancy test. When I tried it, the result was positive. Tears of joy flowed naturally. I couldn't believe it. I decided that I would share this news with Paul when he returned from work, and I hoped that it would cheer me up. I wanted to quickly share the news about my pregnancy with Paul. My excited emotions surged over me like a wave, and I could barely contain myself. I was so happy that I couldn't hide my joy, even though I hadn't been to the doctor yet and the results might be unreliable. It was my moment, the moment when I felt that my life and our marriage were finally taking on a new meaning. "I'm pregnant," I told him, trying to convey all the emotions that filled my heart. But Paul's face darkened, as if he had just heard something terrible. He looked at me silently, and then said in a harsh, almost aggressive tone, "As a child?" These words, full of frustration and rage, stunned me. His tone was harsh, unlike anything I'd ever heard him say. It wasn't just surprise, it was rejection, as if I had done something irreparable. "I don't want a baby, damn it," his voice became hoarse with anger, and the words fell like stones into my soul. "That's the worst thing if you're going to grow it yourself." He said it with such contempt that I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was so unexpected and painful that I felt all my emotions, previously full of happiness, instantly replaced by deep sadness. I stood in front of him, unable to understand why he reacted so sharply to something that should have been a joy for both of us. I've never heard him say anything that would confirm that he doesn't want children. Even when we were at the beginning of our marriage, we never discussed it with such frankness. Paul roughly took off his clothes and went to the bathroom, not giving me a chance to answer or explain anything. I stood there, stunned, not believing what had just happened. Why did he say such things? Why wasn't he happy? Why was his reaction so cold and cruel? I couldn't understand how he could react like that, especially after I expected us to be happy. It wasn't just giving up a child. It was something deeper. It was a coldness that penetrated to the very heart of our marriage. Still shaken, I hung up his jacket and was about to take the shirt to the bathroom when I noticed something that caught my attention. A piece of paper came out of his shirt pocket. I reached out to get it, thinking it was some kind of receipt, maybe from today's meeting. But when I saw the text written on the piece of paper, my heart stopped. It was a check from the motel. The motel. My hand, holding this piece of paper, trembled. The shock of this discovery weighed heavily on my heart. It was a shock, like a lightning bolt that pierced my consciousness. Why would Paul, if he really loved me, leave a check from the motel? How could this happen? We were just on the verge of happiness. We were just going to become parents. I felt myself getting cold inside. Why? Why doesn't he love me? Shouldn't a marriage be between two people who love each other, support and appreciate each other? We've only been married for a little over a year, and how could this happen? How could I be so wrong? I got lost in imaginary romances and fantasies about us, about our love, never really getting into a real relationship that could have been. I couldn't accept this harsh reality, but now, after looking at this receipt, everything became clear. Has he been using me since the beginning of our marriage? Was he genuinely in love with someone else, and I was just a comfortable woman who provided him with stability and comfort? All the doubts in my head started to take shape, and I realized that a lot of what was going on between us wasn't the way I thought it was. This could explain his reaction to my pregnancy. It was probably not only fear of responsibility, but also anger, because he did not want this child. Why didn't he tell me before? Why didn't we discuss this before deciding on such an important step in life? Now I saw clearly that he could have been married to me for other reasons, for convenience, for stability. He was reserved and cold like never before. It all made sense. The motel, his reaction to the pregnancy, his behavior in recent weeks, these were the traces of his infidelity. I couldn't ignore these signs anymore. Everything now fell into place, and I realized that the reason he forced me to quit my job was because his mistress worked there. It wasn't just an accident. It was an elaborate game in which I was just a pawn that allowed him to hide his real desires. The boundaries between reality and my thoughts became blurred, but now that I was standing with this check in my hands, there was no doubt. I decided I couldn't just leave it like that. I have to collect evidence of his infidelity, even if it will be painful, but this is the only way I can understand what is really going on in our marriage. Paul never left his cell phone, even when he went into the bathroom. He carefully hid his life from me, and now I realized that it was not just a habit, it was part of his double life. Everything that I used to accept as normal now seemed like a lie to me. When I secretly entered Paul's room, it became clear to me that he was a man who knew how to hide his tracks. The room was perfect, as if it was not his private corner, but an exhibition for prying eyes. The table was neatly cleaned, every object in its place. Nothing disturbed the fragile harmony of this space. I examined the shelves, drawers, looking for traces that could confirm my suspicions. But everything was as it always was, clean, neat, without hints of the secret corners of his life. It became clear to me that it would be difficult to catch him off guard right away. I often checked the pockets of his clothes, hoping to find some evidence, receipts, papers, notes. But the investigation was going hard. He was too careful, and I was too naive to think that everything could be discovered so easily. I thought about hiring a detective, but in my position, with limited funds, this idea seemed impossible. I was a single woman expecting a child, and at that moment I couldn't afford the extra expenses. It didn't add to my confidence, and after thinking deeply, I didn't know how to move on. Suddenly, the bell rang. I looked at the phone screen and was surprised to see my father's number. He rarely called, and always on business. Considering how busy my schedule was, it was hard for me to believe that he could call just like that. "Hello, it's me, your dad. How are you?" he said, and I felt his voice, even through the phone, filled with concern. I was surprised that he called, because he was always busy, absorbed in work. I replied, "Dad, what's going on? Are you busy?" realizing that his call is more than just a conversation. "My staff is fine," he replied, as if justifying his action. "But I'm not too busy not to call." He added that the CEO of the company in France has always been a workaholic, and rarely found time for personal conversations. I remembered with a smile how I hardly played with him as a child, because I was always busy with his work. But I respected his dedication. And now, at this moment, his unexpected call aroused in me not only memories, but also curiosity. What did he want to tell me? I asked what was going on, and to my surprise, my father began to reveal the shocking truth. "Is this really true?" I almost couldn't believe my ears, despite his confidence in his words. "Yes," he replied, and his voice became quiet but firm. "You have to believe me." I felt my heart stop and my throat tighten. What was missing? What did I not understand? His words echoed in my head, and I couldn't immediately react. Shock, mixed with unspeakable anger and disappointment, gripped me. And so, like a puzzle, all the pieces began to fall into place. I thanked him, feeling tears coming to my eyes, and ended the conversation with a quiet, "Thank you, Dad, I'll do everything I can." My trail remained empty, but now I knew that my father was right. I continued to investigate, and unfortunately, the truth that I found out only added to my pain and chagrin. Knowing that I could no longer trust Paul, his actions and behavior became obvious to me. He continued to keep his distance, as if I were a stranger to him. I experienced every moment, every second, but especially this painful tension was felt when I discovered his coldness and indifference. Every time he behaved in this way, I harbored a deep hatred for him. For months, despite my pregnancy, our relationship remained strained, like a string ready to burst at the slightest touch. We both knew that this was not life, but the continuation of existence under one roof, in which everyone hides their true feelings. And so, one ominous evening, everything collapsed. I've always tried to be careful, to avoid quarrels and tense conversations. I kept my thoughts to myself, struggled with my inner feelings. But Paul came home as usual. We sat down at the dining table, and I served dinner, which I prepared with care and love. But, as always, something was wrong. I had no time to take the first bite, when suddenly Paul hit the plate with a fork, and with rage in his voice exclaimed, "What is this? It's tasteless." In his eyes, I saw something that was far from the usual irritability. He threw the food I had prepared right on the floor, and I was left confused, not understanding what was going on. Anger rolled over me like a wave. I couldn't understand why he did that, and at that moment everything inside me fell into place. It wasn't just an outburst of irritation. It was another step in his cold detachment, in his desire to humiliate me. I tried to process what had happened and said, albeit with difficulty, "You've been complaining about the taste of food since I got pregnant. I try to cook healthier food, use fewer seasonings." I tried to explain that it was temporary, that I would do everything to make him happy, but he interrupted me with a mocking smile. "You, a woman with a belly like a monster, I will have to raise the child myself," he said, looking at my swollen belly with a malicious grin and disgust. I was always afraid that this day might come, but deep down I hoped for a different result. This moment still caught me by surprise, no matter how I prepared. I quickly went to my room, opened my desk drawer and took away the documents that I had been collecting for several days in a row, knowing that I might have to take this step after all. I returned to the living room where Paul was sitting and, without giving in to hesitation, handed him the documents. "Okay, here are the divorce papers," I said, as calmly as possible, thrusting a folder of papers at him. His face immediately twisted in shock, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. "What the hell?" he muttered, stammering when the documents were in his hands. He obviously did not expect this, and probably hoped that everything would remain the same. "Well, it was your idea," I added, not giving him time to think. "Now sign them quickly, I'll send them tomorrow." I was talking, but inside I had a strange, almost painful feeling, as if I had cut myself off from something important, from what used to be a part of my world. It wasn't as easy as I imagined, but I had already made up my mind. "Are you serious?" he asked, looking at me in surprise, but there was more and more irritation in his voice. "Do you really want a divorce?" "Actually, I've been thinking about getting a divorce since I started suspecting your infidelity." I said it calmly, but everything was boiling inside, and every word was filled with pain, which I held back for a long time. But with a baby in my arms, I wasn't sure if I could feed myself. I added that as an excuse, even though I actually knew there was more to it. There was something in his behavior that betrayed his true intentions, and I could no longer pretend not to notice anything. Now I had another plan. I was determined, and it clearly provoked Paul. His face turned red with anger, and gritting his teeth, he exhaled, "Just watch, I'll make you regret every moment when you looked down on me and controlled me. Do you think you can survive without me? You have a child to take care of. You're going to regret this." His threat was in almost every word, in every look. But I didn't feel afraid. I felt only relief. Yes, I was on the right track. He couldn't keep me under his control anymore. "I'll be fine, don't worry about me," I said, trying to sound firm and confident despite his anger. Paul was unwavering in his contempt for me, and this irritation, which he was clearly trying to hide, became apparent with every word. He grabbed the divorce papers and started filling in the blanks, as if reluctantly, but not knowing what else to do. "Here you go, if this is what you wanted, this is yours," he said, throwing the signed papers on my desk. I replied, "Thank you," and took them away. Something was pinching inside me again, but I couldn't afford to be weak. I decided a long time ago that this would be the last step, and I did it. Paul probably didn't think that I would actually file for divorce. He handed them over without much fuss, perhaps hoping that I would change my mind, that I would remain a part of him. But I didn't come back. The next day, I quickly filed for divorce and left the house, leaving everything behind. I knew that he would be surprised when he returned from work and found that I had left. But it didn't matter anymore. I moved into my parents' house. My father's return from France was not only an emotional support for me, but also a practical step in the right direction. He asked me to stay with them, and I didn't hesitate. At that moment, I realized that I no longer needed to carry this burden that had been dragging me down all my life. I was deeply grateful to my father for offering shelter and help during this difficult time. The day I left Paul's house, I received 3 calls from him. But I ignored all of them, not because I didn't care, but because I knew I shouldn't answer. It was important for me to give myself time. After a while, his calls stopped. It became clear that I was just another figure in his life that could be pushed aside. He was probably pleased with his mistress, and maybe soon you won't even remember me anymore. I decided that I needed to move on without turning around. 5 months have passed. I gave birth to a child, and it was safe, without complications. I enjoyed a peaceful life at my parents' house. I didn't need the field, I didn't feel its absence. I was calm, I had a child who was my light during this dark period. This was my chance to start all over again, without regrets, without looking back. But one day Paul called again. In the beginning, I ignored his calls like before. But after several persistent attempts, I couldn't avoid answering anymore. I picked up the phone and said only one word, "Hi, what do you want?" His voice was filled with a mixture of surprise and anger. "What's going on? Why were you on this show?" he asked, his tone almost desperate. "Since when did you become the daughter of a CEO with millions of dollars? I never knew you had such connections." I froze. "How did you find out about this?" I couldn't help but ask. His voice seemed to pierce me, and I realized that he was completely stunned by what had happened. It turned out that Paul was watching TV. On one of the popular shows, where they discussed the luxurious lifestyle of the CEO's family. My father, as CEO of a well-known global technology company, found himself in the spotlight. The producers of the show came to our house to film our everyday life, and told us about the welfare of our family, mentioning an approximate estimate of $25 million. I never imagined that Paul would see this show. But the power of television is really something. The whole world can literally see what used to be hidden behind 4 walls. And now, sitting in the room, clutching the phone in my hands, I realized that this moment was not only my personal victory, but also a turning point in his life. By the way, I didn't tell you that I have an asset of $45 million. I said these words calmly, as if they were a trifle, and not something that could radically change our whole lives. This was the result of an advanced inheritance that I received recently, and it gave me the confidence that even after my divorce from Paul I would be able to live comfortably. Yes, my father informed me about the inheritance, which was a real help in this decision. I continued, watching his reaction. There was a moment of silence in the room. Paul was stunned. There was not a single hint of joy in his voice. He hadn't expected this. The reaction was immediate, and his rage was obvious. "It's dirty," his voice trembled with indignation. Why didn't you tell me about this before? Then half of it would be my right. He clenched his fists, and I could feel his rage building. But I didn't let myself be confused. Give me the money now, he added with icy confidence, as if I were obligated to support him. It was typical of him. I knew that was the only thing he could expect from me. I answered calmly, as I suspected. After watching the show, all he could think about was getting money from me. Gifts from parents are not included in the division of property, I said, not moving from my place, although there was a real storm inside me. Paul was silent, confused. You're forgetting your own mistakes, Paul, I continued, no longer holding back my irritation. You cheated, didn't you? You started dating this woman, your new wife, even before our wedding, and you didn't even try to hide it. Paul was clearly shocked. His eyes widened, and you didn't seem to know how to react. But I already knew that nothing would be hidden. My father, having many contacts in his company, shared with me the information that Paul tried to keep secret. I never mentioned it, but now I'm going to demand alimony, I said, and it was no longer just a statement. That was my demand. I was no longer the one who was afraid and suffering in the shadow of his infidelities. Paul continued to recant, to protest. As always, he tried to shift the blame onto me. Stop joking, why do I have to pay alimony? It's all because of you, he shouted. You're right, you got pregnant on your own, without me. You stayed at home and did nothing, and now you're blaming me. I couldn't believe my ears. He did not apologize, did not admit his mistakes. All he could do was blame me. How could I ever be with him? How could I not see that he was actually a man with no respect for himself or me? His painful excuse, which I heard, sounded so pathetic and inappropriate that I went from anger to utter disbelief. I couldn't believe that I had once been married to this man, that I had once believed in his words, hoped for his changes. Now, more than ever, I was sure that I had made the right choice by breaking this connection. I grabbed the phone tighter and, trying to keep my voice calm, said, "Do you even realize how funny you're talking?" I paused, feeling my patience running out. I don't want to deal with you anymore, Paul. It's over. I'll have my lawyer handle the alimony issue, and you don't call me anymore. You won't see the baby anymore. Goodbye. And with that, I hung up the phone. He tried to call a few more times, but I immediately blocked his number. It's over now, I thought, trying to calm my nerves, lightening the load I've been carrying for so long with every word. I took a deep breath and looked away and picked up the phone again, no longer afraid that it would disrupt my life again. I didn't need to explain myself to him anymore. Everything was decided. There was no place for him in my world anymore. But as soon as I realized this, I heard my baby crying from the other room. My peaceful life was interrupted again, but this time, not by his intervention. I hurried to him, forgot about the phone and tried to calm the baby, feeling his little hands clench in my hands. That was the moment when I knew everything was going to be okay. I was ready. The next day, I was informed that Paul started paying alimony as soon as I submitted the documents. I felt relieved, but deep down I knew that his life would not be the same as before. But now I was no longer a part of it. Soon, a former colleague of Paul contacted me and informed me that he claimed that his new wife was very frugal, and now he had to cover his living expenses with debts. His situation wasn't improving, but it didn't matter to me anymore. It seems that because of these circumstances, Paul, with his eternal penchant for manipulation and momentary desires, tried to get his share of my inheritance. He called me, and I heard a familiar note of desperation in his voice, as if he believed that his problems could be solved with one call. However, no matter how hard he tried, I didn't give him a penny. My inheritance remained beyond his reach. The path he chose led him to the point where his expenses far exceeded his income, and now he had to contend with difficulties that he could not avoid. He felt his world crumbling, and did not even try to hide it from others. Every day he faced the contempt of colleagues who looked down on him, knowing that his disorder and unprofessionalism had become apparent. But that wasn't his only downfall. He made a mistake, one of those that cannot be fixed. He started looking for a new job only after he left his current company. And now he was trapped, without a stable income, with debts, and, as I learned, in complete financial ruin. When I heard about it from one of his former colleagues, I didn't feel a drop of regret. On the contrary, I was completely unmoved by it. I felt no compassion for him, not for the fact that he was once a part of my life, but for his own powerlessness, his pride and inability to understand that everything he had, he lost with his own hands. He deserved all the hardships, I thought, watching this destruction as if it were a thing he had created himself. I couldn't forget the harsh words and cruel behavior he once showed me. The cooling of his feelings for me did not disappear from my memory, and I sincerely hoped that now he would understand what it was like to be at the very bottom. Because, no matter how he justified himself, I gave my part to him. He chose this path himself. While his life was plunging into chaos, I was building my own. I was no longer a lonely and confused woman who needed to survive in a relationship with him. My child grew up healthy and happy, and I felt the support and love that came from my home, from parents who were always there to help and support me. With their help, I felt confident again. My future was in my hands, and I knew I could handle any difficulty that got in my way. And then, at the very moment of my internal stabilization, my father, a successful CEO, suddenly informed me that he wanted to transfer his company to me. This news both amazed and inspired me. He has always been a hardworking and purposeful person, and now that he has said these words to me, I feel that it is my new responsibility to preserve and develop what he has created. It was not just an inheritance in a monetary or material sense. It was a huge responsibility, and I knew I had to be ready. My father always believed in me, and this faith has become an inexhaustible source of strength for me. I realized that in order to cope with this new stage, I need to prepare. I started studying business, delving into the details of management, taking on small tasks to understand how the company works, how this whole huge will functions. I knew it would be hard, that I would have to face problems, mistakes, but I was determined. And that was perhaps the most important thing, to be ready to face any difficulties. My child was there for me, my parents supported me, and all this gave me the strength to move forward. Living with my parents gave me a chance to start over. It was a second chance, for a new life, for new opportunities, to regain peace and self-confidence. Every day I became stronger, more confident in my abilities. Now, thanks to my parents, I could afford the joy that every moment brings, every moment spent with my child. His laughter, his small steps, his gentle touches, all this filled my house with light. Now I could see how the bygone past was gradually fading. The toxic relationship with Paul, his betrayal and cruelty, those painful memories that had plagued me for a long time, began to fade into the shadows. They didn't own me anymore. I grew out of this experience, and now, looking back, I realized that all these lessons that he taught me gave me the strength to become more resilient, more confident in myself. I was ready to build a future that would be worthy not only of me, but also of my child. My life began to blossom, and every day I became more and more confident that my choices were the right ones. The pain of the past now seemed less vivid than before. Hope came in her place, and I saw only opportunities ahead. I was determined to create a stable and happy life for myself and my child. Now that I looked at everything that had happened, I could firmly say that leaving Paul was the best decision I had ever made. He gave me freedom, he gave me a chance to find myself again. I was no longer that woman, confused in the past, insecure and scared. I was a strong woman, ready to go forward to conquer the world. Hopefully, Paul will one day realize the consequences of his actions. As for me, I will continue to move forward, using every opportunity that comes my way and making the most of every day. I am ready for any future. There is no fear in my soul anymore, only the confidence that I will be able to overcome any difficulties.